Good evening, viewers, and welcome once again to Plain Talk. I do apologize for our failure to bring the program last week. We were all set and ready. Mr. Greenidge is smiling because, and we were all flooded out. Anyway, it's good to be back with you. And as I hinted a moment ago, my guest is Minister Mr. Carl Greenidge, Minister of Foreign Affairs, with additional responsibility for international trade. Mr. Greenidge, welcome to Plain Talk.
Good evening, Chris. I'm happy to be able to join you and your viewers again tonight.
Well, it's always such a pleasure. Let me start by asking you this question. Everybody thought Carl Greenidge would be the finance minister. When President Granger signaled to you, you wouldn't be the finance minister, but you have a different portfolio, foreign affairs. Did you feel that it was a good thing for you, maybe less work, less stress?
Well, Chris, I was myself rather taken aback. He didn't tell me that I wouldn't be having finance. He indicated what it was he was going to assign me.
Mm-hmm.
And whilst I recognize that these are the prerogatives of heads of political parties, I was rather taken aback. On reflecting as to the new portfolio, I got the impression that in terms of, if you like, from the technical side,
Mm-hmm.
being familiar with these issues that might arise and perhaps how one goes about handling them
In which one of the portfolios?
in relation to foreign affairs.
Yes.
I did think that, well, this certainly would not be as stressful a post as finance. That I was certain of at that time. And it just goes to show how wrong you can be, because within a matter of days, we were into the story with the Venezuelan decree.
Of course, Mr. Winston Jordan, the Minister of Finance, will probably tell you, look, I've got rice, I've got sugar, I've got gold, I've got flooding, I've got more than my fair.
I'm not suggesting that the weight on the desk of the Minister of Foreign Affairs is more than that in finance. I'm just saying, from a person moving from finance to foreign affairs, and knowing the sorts of things that finance had, I would not have. I wasn't particularly worried from that angle, but in fact, there are many dimensions of foreign affairs with which I'm not familiar, and one of them is the number of foreign entities, agencies, representatives, I don't know what you call them, as well as Guyanese who put themselves in a position of being somehow foreign but nationals. What I'm trying to say is that I find that whereas as the Minister of Finance, you can say to people or potential visitors, I'm sorry, I realize that you want to discuss something important, but I'm pretty busy at this point in time. Budget is 2 months down the road or whatever. And they will understand. Somehow, I don't think that is possible with foreign affairs. You have the representatives of governments that wish to see you, and you can't tell them no. Perhaps you can say not today, next week, but it's just a rescheduling problem. In the case of the nationals, that perhaps is even more sensitive, because if they've been abroad, they somehow feel that they have a right, they should have access to you. And very often you find that they are here for 3 days, or they've got 3 days left, and today is the only day that they're available. But they need to see you.
That they're available rather than you're available.
They need to see you because it's a matter of life and death. So that is a dimension that I hadn't really anticipated. That's
Now,
a demand on your time.
You wouldn't consider yourself as having been unprepared for this kind of portfolio, given your own background in Europe, the ACP.
No, and even here, the trade matters I've dealt with. I, one of my portfolios was Minister of Trade. The international cooperation dimension in relation to working alongside in or around the World Bank and so forth, I'm quite familiar with those. Of course, the foreign affairs issues, I would have touched on at a variety of points from where I sat in cabinet, and especially in relation, as you say, in Europe, because although normally Guyana-EU relations would fall squarely in the bailiwick of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, for a long time I shared that with Minister Ashley Jackson and subsequently Cedric Grant when he was holding that portfolio. So I've had a lot of insight into these matters, although not as much or not a great deal of insight on the bilateral front. And in that arena, there's a lot to be learned. And even in the multilateral political front, the UN issues, UNOSUR type issues, new bodies, for example, new complexities. So there are still areas that one has to now learn and come to grips with reasonably quickly.
I think it's probably true to say that all electorates give a new government a break, what's called a honeymoon.
Yeah.
Have you all been afforded that opportunity with all the challenges, natural and otherwise, that you've had to confront?
I believe that the citizens, or most citizens, have granted us a honeymoon period, and notwithstanding those complaints which have surfaced, we are still there. However, you are right. Perhaps every honeymoon is a different story. Somebody will tell you a honeymoon, but few of them ever are completely without challenges. And this current arrangement that you're describing is one such, because something like the flooding, for example, the exceptional rains, as soon as we came to office, I remember raising this with colleagues. And I do remember them, without needing to be persuaded, recognizing the import of this. And as you saw, immediately with the rains, there were arrangements put in place, well, for cleaning of Georgetown.
Yes.
And then for the rains. The problem is, however, as I mentioned in cabinet, that this is it's a complex problem, the problem of the drainage of Georgetown now, because first of all, you're draining, but it is not Georgetown. It's more than Georgetown. And you are working with a problem of, if you like, simply ensuring that water is run off. But you've got a whole set of institutional problems. Mayor and City Council, the old Georgetown Water and Sewage Authority, the NDIA, a whole set of bodies with overlapping responsibilities, various competencies or incompetencies. And maybe, and I said this to my colleagues, that maybe with the greatest competence lying not so much in any of those entities, but probably in Gaisuco, which had been able over the years to maintain both the architecture and the manpower to do the irrigation side.
Yes.
But also with a considerable capacity on the drainage side. And I am not yet sure whether arrangements are properly in place in the medium and long term to ensure that the transfer of capacity has taken place. So it is, in other words, a lot of these things arose, as with Venezuela and water, for example, and we are still challenged to put in place the mechanisms that will help us to manage the challenge efficiently.
We have had, over the past couple month and a half, you've had two sets of flooding practically. The intensity and the frequency have increased. Is Georgetown, our coastal area, I know that is not your forte, but are we facing something of an almost existential threat in that regard?
Well, Chris, let me start by telling you that this afternoon, you see this broken up old telephone I have here. This morning when I left my house, I drove along Sheriff Street immediately outside of Bel Air Gardens, and I took about 12 pictures, which I've taken the liberty of sending them to the minister responsible for infrastructure.
Poor David.
And the reason why I'm telling you this is because when we had a discussion on this in cabinet, I did say to colleagues, look, in my view, you will be making a mistake if you try to say to citizens, look, there are 6 things that matter here. Sluices, a couple of canals and pumps, outfalls and pumps, and we have fixed 60% of those. We're going to fix the remaining 40 by Friday. I said to them, don't go in that direction at all, because this is a complex system, and there are many things happening. You're not going to be able to have 5 defined things that you say, these 5 things will solve it. I've done 3. Everything will be in place, because you will do all of those and still it isn't working. And I'm making this point to tell you, first of all, even the stats are wrong. My house in Bel Air Gardens, which has 2 floors and which I raised by about 8 inches to a foot in 2006 or 2007,
That's after the 2005 flooding.
after the flooding, was flooded not twice in the last 6 weeks, but 3 times. Okay, and when I left for Brazil with the president, I left a house. I was wearing Wellingtons. The Wellingtons were being worn in the house because there was so much water in the house that, in fact, there was no point in wearing the Wellingtons because the water was coming into the Wellingtons in the house, and that is not a reflection of my height. These are standard Wellingtons. As it was, there was a vehicle in the driveway the night when I went to bed, 4-wheel drive, a Jeep, and I had to stand on the lip of the door, put the suitcase onto the top of that vehicle, because I didn't want the clothes I was going to go to the airport with covered in water. So I did that, reversed out of the yard as gingerly as I could, because I didn't want water getting up the exhaust and going and cracking the cylinder head. So what I'm saying to you is that the problem, in my view, has very little to do with climate change. This problem in Georgetown, I don't care what the experts tell you. When you look, I first went to live in Pear Street, Kitty, in 1974 or thereabouts, and I've seen a lot of heavy rain. If you don't keep the drains clean, if the size of the drains is getting smaller or they're getting shallower, any amount of rainfall floods everywhere.
Yeah.
And what is more, the water doesn't move. So I remember in 1989, I was at a GPC board meeting one morning, and by the time I got home at 2, I just moved into Bel Air Gardens. All the books which I had, and the records in particular that I'd moved and hadn't properly stored, had been inundated in the study. But the point I'm trying to make is that the problem is of the maintenance of a system, and if the system has been allowed to collapse, all along Sheriff Street you will find tire shops and other shops where are located on drains. In other words, they're blocking drains. If you look behind them, you'll see the rest of the guttering behind Norton Street. Even in
South Road.
Yeah, well, South Road is one of the worst with businesses narrowing the canal from 10 feet to 3 feet so that you can park trucks and so forth.
Shouldn't the government take action in this matter?
Absolutely. And I think the only thing I would say to you is that both Mr. Greenidge and the culprits are very lucky that I have not been asked to do a job that had anything to do with control of those places, because a lot of people would have been locked up. I think we are far too we condone too much these excesses which amount to lawlessness.
And it becomes a
threats,
new norm.
and people accept that this is what has been done. Why are you worrying? Why are you worrying? But the problem with the water in particular, since you raised those, is of course it puts us all at risk. Why should somebody, simply because they want to put a concrete bridge and block a drain, be able to do that in circumstances that lead to the rest of us being at risk from waterborne diseases?
Or some of these businessmen pushing bush trucks.
Well, yeah, well, that is.
I mean,
yeah.
this is unacceptable. But and I think, and I know, look, we understand each minister has his own portfolio. But when the public and the press, as far as the public and the press are concerned, you're the government, you ought to be dealing with these matters.
Absolutely.
That kind of lawlessness really has no place in a society. And as you say, it puts everybody at risk. Now, we mentioned part of your responsibility, international trade. Now, to what extent do rice and sugar fall within your portfolio, that aspect of it?
Well, the sugar industry has for most of its history been a self-contained industry, meaning that it has been the beneficiary of a preferential market, an arrangement under which
that was the SPS. It was called special.
The initial one from the independence days.
Yes.
It has access to a preferential market, European market up until relatively recently, and therefore the question of marketing of sugar really wasn't a big challenge for the government as such. They would talk to the U.S., try to make sure that the Caribbean maintains the demand there. Rice was perhaps a little more of a challenge.
Of course, sugar is probably the problem. The problems are really in production.
Yes, today that is absolutely the case. But
in rice is the reverse.
Rice is the opposite. Yeah, rice is the opposite. The responsibilities are for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the sense that where a market problem exists and markets need to be identified, then we are expected to help to search out markets and bring our producers and the markets
Do you
together.
Do you have that kind of personnel in your ministry at this stage?
It's not a marketing function. It is in a sense opening the market has to do with using the government to government arrangement or government to regional arrangements to identify opportunities and to put the producer and buyers together. But it cannot be the case, at least at this point in time, where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can be expected to say, get up one day and say, look, these are the specs, Mr. So-and-so in Korea. Let us talk quantum, let's talk prices, specs and all these. The producers and the representatives of the producers will have to do that. But in terms of identifying where they are, first of all, identifying where there are markets in deficit that need the products you have, or even if that the gap has not been identified, if you spot a potential, which one could do, complementarity in markets and production, we can bring them together. But we are not supposed to be replacing a function that, say, the rice producers would normally carry out, negotiation of prices and all that, unless it's a government-to-government agreement. Of course, where there's potential for such agreements, we will be part of that.
But if you have a resident representative in country A,
Mm-hmm.
and that person sends back a wire, look, there's a serious rice problem in this country,
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's a private sector
Yes.
issue, shouldn't that be part of the...
Yes, that happens when they identify needs, either that at the initiative of the let us say ambassador or ambassadorial staff, or at the request of the country in which the embassy is located. We have a responsibility to bring the producer, raise the awareness of the producer. This is a potential market. Is there anything we can do to help? This is the quantities that in which they may be interested. We can tell you something about prices that they may be receiving from other agencies, and therefore it might be something of interest to you. And if there's any facilitation, any other facilitation required, it can be done. But I just want to make it clear that the ministry does not retain an expert in rice, in the sense that you have somebody who has a degree and 20 years experience in rice marketing that can come and negotiate the actual agreement.
But let us say the President Granger, Foreign Minister Carl Greenidge are going in a particular country. It's very normal. I mean, you take President Obama, Prime Minister of the UK. They always make sure they have a bigger commercial team, industrial and
Exactly,
commercial.
yes, absolutely, and that must be the case here too. And sometimes you don't have a commercial team, but the issue still arises. When we were in Panama, the president and I went across to greet the president of Panama.
When you were in Panama?
When we were in Barbados.
Barbados. As the heads of government.
The president of Panama addressed the meeting and suggested to the president that we go over and say hello to him, especially since we've had good relations with Panama. Recently opened the air route to them and so
yes,
forth.
that's the Copa airline.
Yeah, Copa airline. And as soon as I introduced the president to him, he lit up, and we started talking about what was going on, including showing that he was quite knowledgeable. And then he immediately says, we would like some rice.
Wow.
You know, we need rice Monday. This was a Friday.
Yes.
Can you get someone to talk to us about selling us rice, both by way of an immediate set of shipments and in terms of a longer term arrangement to set up some storage facilities here by which rice can be shipped to Guyana, stored here, and large shipments can be delivered from Panama to elsewhere in the world, rather than waiting on small shipments to be coming out of Guyana.
What follow-up has taken place with that initiative?
We immediately sent the information both to the Minister of Agriculture, the producers, and the board.
Rice Export Board?
Yes. And they responded by the Monday with some prices and some timing, and that discussion has been going on. They, of course, had some concerns because some previous shipments had been made and some portion of that shipment hadn't been paid for. So I think they were concerned to make sure that whatever might have been the causes of those non-payments or delayed payments, that they would not encounter a repetition. So that discussion has been going on, and before I went off to Brazil, I asked our trade people to follow and make sure, and I've seen some correspondence on it. I don't think a shipment has actually been made yet, but that's one way in which we can help in that regard. And another, of course, you can carry people from the industry itself. In the Barbados case, we have a section that deals with international trade agreements, and the head of that is Neville Totoram, and he was there on hand to, he wasn't there when we spoke to the president, but subsequently I put him in touch with the senior official from Panama who provided him with the coordinates of the persons that needed to be contacted.
There seems to be, and I hope, Minister Greenidge, you can clarify this for the benefit of the public and for myself, some uncertainty as to what is the status of the rice element of the agreement we have with neighboring Venezuela. We have heard that they said no further shipment. We've heard disputes. The Prime Minister said yes, the PPP knew about this a long time ago. We heard the Finance Minister went to Venezuela. What is the position as you know it?
Well, in these matters, when so many people are involved, there's always going to be some lack of clarity. from where the Ministry of, from the point of view of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I think it needs to be clear. There is an agreement between the government of Guyana and Venezuela, which covers Petrocaribe. That's the oil.
Yes.
And that is an agreement that's a self-standing agreement. The government of Guyana then approached Venezuelans about the sale of rice to Venezuela, and Venezuela has arrangements for importing rice. They did agree to purchase rice from us, and there's a schedule under which they purchase that rice with specified times and with provision for the termination of the arrangement
In
on
terms
the
of
basis
rice.
Rice, on the basis of notice. The Venezuelans need to give us notice, I think 1 month's notice, in the event that they're terminating the agreement. But what has actually occurred has been this. The Venezuelans indicated at some point, and there was a public statement made to that effect, that they would not be taking the or further shipments of rice. And the producers were told this, just as the vessels that went to pick up the oil were also told, we will not be providing you with oil until further notice, so you may wait, but we are not providing you as per schedule. Now, in the case
That would be in violation of the agreement, though.
in both cases, yes. But you know, the thing is, in truth, all commercial arrangements have hiccups. And it is possible that a hiccup occurred, and maybe even coincidentally hiccups occurred. But what made the situation difficult here was when the Venezuelan authorities were asked, because you can ask it from two angles, from the men who were actually dealing with receiving the shipment of rice,
Yes.
okay, and from the authorities via Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who would say to their counterparts, because there's a provision in the agreement, if there's a dispute or a problem, that official channels will be used. Those official channels have to do with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the two sides. So the Venezuelans were asked, both at the technical level, if you like, at the operational level, and at the diplomatic level. And the response has up to now been oral, which leaves scope for problems. And it has not been definitive. At no point have the Venezuelans said, look, we have decided to discontinue this. And I'm speaking now of post-May 26th.
Yes.
But there was, and I think this is perhaps where some of the confusion arose, the Venezuelans informed the Minister of Finance, I understand, from him in his meeting, that they had signaled earlier, and I think there's reason to believe that that wasn't the only time at which they said it, that this contract, not that last shipment in June, but that this contract will not necessarily be renewed. We've taken it as a one-off, and it won't necessarily be renewed. Well, of course, as a good supplier, you take it that that is something open to negotiation.
Yes.
And I think that is what the producers intended to do. There is a feeling that the willingness of the Venezuelans to honor these contracts now is turning on their view of the evolution of the problem of the border. And so there is always that, but they have not formally indicated that at all.
They've withdrawn their ambassador. Is that ambassador back in Georgetown?
No, the ambassador has been recalled for consultation. As I say, this is their right.
What does that mean in diplomatic terms?
In diplomatic terms, when a government is unhappy with the host government,
Yes. Venezuela unhappy with Guyana.
Venezuela unhappy with Guyana's behavior, they may recall the ambassador. That is one means of expressing their unhappiness or dissatisfaction. In fact, it may also happen if they are not satisfied that the ambassador is doing as as well as he should or she should. So the ambassador was recalled. I'm not sure what for, but from the president's pronouncement, in Maduro's pronouncement, it was clear that he wanted to make a point.
Yes.
He said this. He's going to withdraw, and when time passes, they're going to take a decision about future cooperation. And so he mentioned the future cooperation in that context.
Now, we didn't seek any tit for tat. What did we do about our representative in Venezuela?
We are not the ones that are disputing anything, you know. So at this point in time, I see no reason to advise or to take action to respond in similar.
So
vein.
we have a representative in
Our ambassador's there. Ambassador De Silva is still there, and carries out his normal functions that are expected of him, and the Venezuelans allow him to carry out his functions. We didn't stop them carrying out their functions, and contrary to a popular perception outside of Guyana, the problem with the airline had nothing to do with any dispute between the two sides. The airline problem was a long-running one in which all these airlines are required to lodge certain guarantees once they're operating. And this one, I think, suffer as all Venezuelan airlines would do at the moment, suffers from the shortage of foreign exchange.
Yeah.
So that is really the source of the difficulty. And we would have been prepared. We did signal to them, at least Foreign Affairs had signaled a willingness to try and find a way around that problem, to see whether there was a way to allow the airline to be able to meet its obligation without having to bring cash out of Venezuela to lodge it here. But that didn't work out in the end, and they then decided that they wanted to return the passengers who had been stranded one night in Georgetown, and after that they would decide what next they would do. And that's where it is.
How seriously and adversely has this relationship with Venezuela been affected? How grave is the problem?
I would say that the problem is grave. Venezuela and Guyana have, over the last 40 or so years, had what one could describe as a rather strange relationship. A relationship of how should I put it? Formal and cordial relations for long periods, punctuated by extreme and severe disjunctures, you know. So you got issues of decrees in 68. You have issues of a charge being declared persona non grata for stimulating and being involved in the encouragement and more of a rebellion in the Rupununi. You have issues such as a Venezuelan gunboat, a corvette, actually coming into waters up until that time recognized as Guyana's waters, and seizing a vessel, the occupants thereof, and carting them off to a prison. And for all Venezuelans talk today, the government of Venezuelans talk today about their problem being with Exxon. The vessel that has actually been seized has nothing to do with Exxon. They're a completely different company. And Anadarko, the Techniques Perdana,
Yes.
was not an Exxon vessel that they seized in 2013. So there are inconsistencies in the behavior of the Venezuelan government. But sometimes when you look at these things, in their explanations, but when you look at their behavior, it has a pattern. Venezuelans' first actions in respect of 1966 and that period had to do with trying to prevent Guyana becoming independent.
Yes.
Maybe the intention was somehow by dint of their power to be able to seize the whole of Guyana. Because if you can sign an agreement, you can acknowledge that it is valid, you can define the borders physically on the basis of that agreement, and then one day get up and say, you know something, that agreement is not valid, let's reopen it. There's nothing to stop them coming to say, well, look, it isn't merely Essequibo that should be ours, it is the whole area. You never knew that Venezuela had its eyes on the area around where the Exxon is now working, until there was an announcement that there was oil there. This is 120 miles off the coast of Guyana. And let me just remind people of something. There's the Treaty of Munster, what it was, 1642, which is an European treaty, the treaty among colonialists identifying the counties, what we now call the counties, as being, that is Demerara and Essequibo on the one hand, as being part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. You had, of course, a special arrangement in relation to Berbice, where the Van Per family was given a grant. By the time you got to the 1780s and 1790s, as part of the Dutch capitulation after the Napoleonic Wars, these territories, including and separately, were handed to the British. Are you with me? So there's a long history to this, and none of that history has any connection whatsoever with a Spanish, with any Spanish sovereignty over these areas.
You were saying just now, though, that there's a pattern, and you started with 66. Sorry. Yes.
The pattern is that from time to time, when it seems convenient, independence being one, or a politically opportune time where perhaps there are internal problems in Guyana, or
Guyana?
Yes, political problems,
yes,
where they perceive there may be political weaknesses and an opportunity to divide, or where governments in Venezuela themselves are unpopular and need somehow to mobilize the public. These are the times when action beyond the normal action beyond the normal noises, that is simply diplomatic speak, are taken. And if you look at the cases, they have actually now been increasing. They're becoming more severe. I mean, you've moved from
desperation almost.
You've moved from a time in which a decree would be passed. It was passed and then withdrawn. Then you got the seizure of a vessel, and now there is a decree which not only identifies an arena or it identifies a sea space larger and outside of any area that anybody had ever recognized as having anything whatsoever to do with Venezuela. And with that, you calling upon the Navy and the Civil Defense Forces to defend that area. Now, the example I used up to this afternoon with a deputy minister who called was this: if I have a piece of land and a house on it, and you were my neighbor with a piece of land and a house on it, nobody can say to you, look, you don't have a right to put in place surveillance arrangements to protect your land and your house. Okay? One can understand that you recognize that my yard may be used as a means of getting to you. Somebody may come into my yard and jump the fence. But that does not, my friend, give you, under any law I know, the right to appropriate or annex my yard in order to help to keep you secure. And that's what the security zone is about.
I recall in 1966, which gives an idea of our respective ages, I guess, Mr. Greenidge.
Indeed.
Mr. Burnham had his diplomats strategically placed in almost every important capital of the world, all the important fora. How well prepared? Because what I'm asking you as well is, have we got our full complement of diplomats around in all the capitals and in all the important fora to propagate our case and to win support for it?
Well, let me say first of all that these times are different from those that prevailed when the circumstances that prevailed when LFS Burnham was in office. But you've gone to the core. That is, relative to the challenges that he faced, he had an extremely well-equipped diplomatic service. He had a fairly comprehensive and well-thought-out strategy initially. Initially meaning that from the beginning.
Yes.
And the implementation of that strategy proved to be effective. But because you ended up with a situation in which a large neighbor with military power, which had taken efforts to, or initiated efforts to actually seize some part of your lands, was dissuaded from carrying out any more of those adventures. Today, the problem is more complicated because for that and other reasons, during LFS Burnham's time and prior to 92, Guyana had developed a reputation in diplomatic circles.
Non-aligned movement.
Non-aligned movement being perhaps the most outstanding and most notable case. That movement has, of course, declined since that time, and you now have the G77, which doesn't carry similar power. But what I can say is that the work of Guyana and its diplomatic service in the other arenas, G77, United Nations, even within the ACP and the Commonwealth, and its influence even within CARICOM has declined, not only as a result of not having the same quantum or range of skills as Burnham had, but because of deliberate policy to run down the diplomatic corps. And that is something that we can't fix overnight, and it has consequences. In a way, we are left having almost been caught off guard by the audaciousness of the decree that Maduro actually issued.
Usually, apart from the diplomatic armory with which you surround yourself, some countries would have defense pacts, so that, look, if my territory is attacked, do we have any kind of protection? Maybe CARICOM without much resources. What do we have to protect ourselves? Suppose Venezuela, suppose President Maduro would decide, look, I'm sending my boats in, I'm seizing territory.
As far as I'm aware, we have no pacts at all that would protect us from such action. And as you saw, when Venezuela seized the Techniques Perdana, we had only to resort to diplomatic initiatives to try to dissuade them and to encourage them to release the vessels. This may be something that we could consider. Well, you know, the old approach of Guyana is that you try and ensure deepened and friendly relationships with all your neighbors. And in fact, in this part of the world, you have the shadow of the big imperialist, the so-called elephant in the room, as part of the whole globe. That elephant looks and casts its shadow everywhere. But it is also the case that within the Americas, of course, you have what some people regard as sub-imperialists. If gunboat diplomacy was a feature of the 19th century, it isn't completely absent from the Americas in the second millennium, in this current millennium. And so one has to be careful. We would not want to align with one sub-imperialist against another. But what I think has to be recognized the case of Guyana's border is a complex one in the sense that the border on the west is not a border with one country. In
Mhm.
other words, this border that is called the Essequibo, the border to the west, the north-south border, is a border defined in relation to territory controlled by Venezuela,
Yes.
as well as territory controlled by Brazil.
Yes.
And the idea that the Venezuelans have, which is to force us into a bilateral, because that is really what they want, to force you into a bilateral discussion in which they bully you into conceding them land, can only spell trouble for Guyana, because we are not in a position to give away any of the land we have, in the sense that when under the 1899 agreement, the arbitral award was made, that award took a land space which had been claimed by 3 different countries. So Venezuela has claims, Brazil has claims, and the British had claims. And those claims, for example, were settled by giving the entire mouth of the Orinoco
To Venezuela.
to Venezuela. It is on the basis of the exploitation of the resources in the mouth of the Orinoco, formerly part of Guyana, which Venezuela has grown rich and fat on. And Brazil, as you speak, I was speaking to the ambassador some weeks ago. He tells me reopening of borders or renegotiation of the border. He says, I want to tell you that when we were settling our borders, in one case the Italian king was asked to mediate, and in all cases he took our land and gave it to our neighbors. So anybody is opening any borders, we have scores to settle. Now what
So
then
that
is going to
brings in
happen? It is
Brazil now.
ridiculous. You will bring in Brazil. So how we cannot agree to hand to Venezuela land not only do we think is ours, but land which the Brazilians feel
But
may be properly theirs.
Not only do we think is ours, that was the subject of an internationally
No,
accepted
you're saying that
arbitral award, is
you're
it?
saying that as a lawyer, but whilst I acknowledge that, I would say more. Land that Venezuela never exercised sovereignty over. In looking at the history, I can find no period when, apart from when the Pope says you can have all of these new lands, there's no period in which Venezuela ever had any control over these areas. In fact, if you look at the areas, you will see, unlike the Berbice, if you look at these areas, unlike parts of Venezuela which are now occupied by Venezuela, which had been occupied before by the British, you will find no areas with any Spanish names. These are overwhelmingly Dutch names. In other words, these places had always been under the dominion of the Dutch until the British seized them. And although the British seized them long before the Venezuelans themselves became properly independent, the Dutch names remain. The Dutch names remain. So, yes, they did sign an agreement, but the claims that are being made are based upon what is a myth. You can't claim dominion over lands that you never ruled.
But Mr. Greenidge, we are living in the 21st century. You've got a world court. The international order is about peaceful settlement. We've had good officers. Why can't this matter be resolved by some international arbitration?
It can't be resolved because most of the methods in existence require the two parties to agree. And where the two parties are responsible parties who have no malintent and they join the international consensus, there are compulsory devices or tools for settlement.
Yes.
So, as regards the marine space that the Venezuelans are claiming, The Law of the Sea Convention has provision for compulsory settlement of disputes. But what? The Venezuelans not only refused to sign the agreement in 1982, but they refused to approve its adoption by the UN. And since then, they've stayed out. But the point
But the Law of the Sea Convention is still international law now, isn't it?
it is an international law, but it applies to, well, let me put it this way. The way Venezuela sees it is that it's a law for everybody else. But they can unilaterally define marine spaces, notwithstanding the existence of an international law. Amongst the things they did under the decree 1787 was to identify a space off the coast of Berbice and Suriname, allocated to Suriname and Guyana by the tribunal, the Convention of the Law of the Sea, and appropriate for themselves.
What threat does this, as you said, I don't think you used the word preposterous, I'm using that, claim by Venezuela suddenly when you hear there's a possibility of oil, or we're claiming that as well. What threat does Venezuela pose to Guyana and its economic development?
It has posed and has almost always posed since 1966 a negative threat to Guyana's economic development. Because by being a large neighbor, militarily superior and larger, it can simply, by troop movements and by noises, dissuade investors from undertaking investments in Guyana. And that has actually happened. Venezuela has had the audacity to write to potential investors, publish international advertisements, threaten in international fora, commercial bodies undertaking investments in Guyana. This has happened. And that is why in a geographic or geomorphological space, which is a unity that is the same, it's relatively uniform, that we call the Guyanas, you can find oil production in every part of that geological space except in Guyana. And the reason being that little exploration has been done in Guyana, and exploration hasn't been done in Guyana because Venezuela has, each time it sees exploration work going on, sought to discourage, directly or indirectly, the businesses from carrying out their work. That is it.
What are the prospects for the oil exploration and hopefully development continuing apace, uninterrupted?
Well, I believe that at this point in time the prospects are good, although the Venezuelans seem to be looking to take advantage of the space between two regimes in Guyana, the transition. In fact, the PPP administration had got to the point where they were fed up with the Venezuelans and their abuse of the good offices process. They had themselves indicated to the UN that Venezuela is abusing the process, and they could see no prospect of continued fruitful use of that device. And the last time the device had been invoked was when the Venezuelans seized the techniques Padan. That was not under this new administration, it's under the old administration. Yes. And under the old administration, the Venezuelans had agreed that within 40 days they would engage in talks with Guyana.
So you don't see
40 days expired and they refused to talk. There was always an excuse.
In your opinion, you don't see the Venezuelan threat impeding our development work?
Well, I think
for oil and gas.
I think these devices that they have used have been blunted to the extent that now the world has got a little fed up with this. There is actually widely accepted a wide distaste for military intervention and force to seize other exploration vessels and so forth. So that is in place. Exxon has given us the assurance that they will continue. When that oil field is developed, Guyana will be in a position to fund that and similar activities. And it wouldn't matter because Venezuela does not intend to stop its claims.
Just 30 seconds left. Do you see an early settlement during the Carl Greenidge stewardship of the foreign ministry, this matter being resolved and put to rest?
I do not see an early resolution and it being put to rest, but I do see the United Nations tool, that is the Geneva Agreement. If the tools that are available under the Geneva Agreement, the one remaining tool that's available, is utilized, it would, in the eyes of the rest of the world, bring this matter to a close, and Venezuela will be seen to be practicing exactly what it has been trying to practice, namely to bully a small territory by means of illegal claims and illegal assertion of power in a bid to seize other people's assets and resources.
Mr. Greenidge, when we started this program, we were talking about some of the challenges you face. I think it's fair to say that all Guyanese, every Guyanese, PPP, PNC, APNU, every Guyanese is very much behind you, and we wish you success, and we're asking for you to bring success in resolving and getting this I don't like the term monkey off our backs, but you know that has been used.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate the confidence that you have you show in my competence. And let me just say that the strength with which I can go forward on this matter is very much dependent. It owes the strength is owed to the extent to which Guyanese are universally in support of this case on our behalf.
No question about that. So, Mr. Greenidge, again, thank you. It's been a pleasure having you. Operators and viewers, thank you. Good night. I'll see you once again next week. Same time, same channel. And may you have a wonderful week.
Thank you, Chris.